HR workshop that I know that a lot of people have been waiting for. Throughout the Building for Growth program, we have heard a lot of different HR needs expressed, and it's kind of been everything from recruiting to constantly hiring new people and having to keep up with the demand, to how to retain folks, to how do we do a compensation evaluation, how do we manage with COVID stress and this never-ending pandemic. And so there is an infinite amount of things to talk about in this space. And we're excited to have Katie Magoon with us to talk a little bit about us. Katie is an HR expert with more than 20 years of experience in the space. She is the president of People Solutions Center, which focuses on mid-size for-profit and nonprofit organizations and really helps them kind of engage with their growth, do it in a responsible way, really think through it in a holistic way. When we sat down with Katie, we talked about a lot of different things that you all were experiencing. And she's like, yes, I got a tool for that. Yes, I understand that. Yes, we can definitely talk about that. So I think this is going to be a very rich conversation. To situate ourselves a little bit in, the Building for Growth program and what we've discussed. First, I want to take a moment just to highlight so many wonderful organizations with us today doing fantastic work. I think I speak for the entire La Piana team by saying that we are really passionate about working with you all because you are really moving the needle in social change and social justice. And that really makes us excited about all the different things that we're doing with you all, which includes the communities of practice, where we've had some rich conversations. I've had the pleasure of leading one with BIPOC leadership, and I always walk away with those feeling really satisfied. But they cover a range of topics. We've also done a series of workshops now with HR being the latest, and then targeted consulting hours where we're working with you all in identifying kind of specific issues and working with you. So if we have started working on a project together, that's wonderful. If we haven't, just keep that in mind throughout the scope of the project, which runs through June. And just to pin down a little bit more what we've discussed, kind of shared that this is a slide that we've shared multiple times, and it's based on the information that we've heard from you all in terms of high growth needs and the many different ways that kind of takes shape in organizations. Here we're looking at specifically human resources and organizational structure, mid-level management. I know another thing that happens is, we've grown so much, and so how do we move this person who used to be doing this role and is now doing this role, and how do we shape that? So I'm going to stop talking about that because I want to pass it over to Katie, who is not going to tell you about the problem. She's going to tell you about the solutions, and that's kind of what we're all here for. She is going to answer every single HR question and need you're going to have. And if not, we'll have her contact information so you can follow up with her afterwards, because clearly there's a lot of stuff and we're going to do the best that we can to get through what we are able to in these 90 minutes. So Katie, thanks so much for joining us. I'm going to pass it over to you.
Thank you, Humberto. And nothing like setting an expectation from the beginning. I'm going to answer every HR question there is.
Absolutely every question.
Yes, I can tell you up front, I cannot even begin to promise that, because that is the beauty of the HR world, is the minute I could even think of all of them, one of you would come up with a scenario that it was new and different. What we will do today, though, is give you some really strong foundational building blocks of how to think about HR in your organization. And most importantly, what are the things you need to think about so that you're building a culture where people are at the center of it. And it's not just about HR compliance, although we are going to talk about it because it's an important part of your strategy. But more importantly, once you get those things done, how do you go to the next level and what types of things can you put in place? We're going to share a lot of things in some cases, what are the challenges that you do need to be looking for, but we are also going to make sure you walk away with very practical tips and tricks for how to build your HR strategy and some things to put in place. So I will tell you there is a lot of content here. If this is me for the entire hour and a half, you will get a lot out of it, but I'd really like to make sure we engage along the way. So first of all, please use the chat and put your questions in there. I'm really good at checking that as we go and making sure if there's a question that's come up, I can circle back to it either in the moment if it's specific to a particular topic, or making sure I capture it as soon as there's kind of a break in the content. We're also going to use polls along the way. I find those help me just even keep track of how much time to spend in different areas based on your experiences and what that looks like. So please do not hesitate to throw your answers in there along the way. Also, if you have a question and you don't want to put it in chat and you prefer to just state it, go ahead and raise your hand. It'll pop you to the top and I'll be happy to take that question as well. But our goal here is really to make sure you have a good understanding of how do you even start to think about what an HR strategy should look like. And then in addition to talking about how do you develop the strategy, what are some key things and best practices that you could put in place right away? So it'll be a combination of strategic level and also some nice best practices for you to put in too easily. Again, Humberto talked about my background and my experience. And, at the end of the day, I've worked in corporate HR for a large part of my career. The last 6 years have been owning a consulting firm, and at least about 40 to 45% of our business is nonprofits and associations. So I'm very familiar in this space and really tried to pull out the tips that would be most relevant to you all given that set of circumstances. So I think you'll find it to be helpful. So this is likely the way many of you have been feeling about HR as you're in a growing organization. You may feel as though you have been running around, putting out fires, drinking through a fire hose some days, and other days just feeling like the whole place is burning down. Organizations, when they're going through growth, is exciting, it's challenging, but it also very much from an HR perspective can feel like all of a sudden it's all on fire, and what do we do? And how do we get our hands wrapped around that growth? So it's really important that we have a strategy as opposed to just rushing around and putting out fires. HR is actually a very strategic part of your organization. And how do you approach that strategy and figure out in an ideal space, what should this look like over a 1 to 3 year period based on where you're at in your growth cycle? So each of these will look very differently organization by organization. Your HR strategy should absolutely align with the business needs that you are trying to accomplish. And the items that we're going to go through today are going to help bring that into focus so that you could easily put together, here are the things that we're going to need to accomplish in the next 1 to 3 years to make sure that our people are aligned with the vision and also are engaged and fully active in what's happening within your team. SWOT analysis. You all are going through this kind of a program, so I know are well aware of what a SWOT analysis is. But I'll be honest, sometimes when we go to apply this to HR, we have different levels of understanding of the HR space, and so it can become a little bit more challenging. Couple of things to remember when you're doing SWOT specific to your HR space, and then we're going to spend most of our time actually diving into what questions you be asking yourself as it relates to your HR SWOT analysis. Because most of the time when I work with organizations that are going through growth, they know they have strengths, they know they have weaknesses, they're just not sure on the HR side, the specifics of some of the questions they should be asking. One of the things to keep in mind on the SWOT is your strengths and your weaknesses are really about looking internally. So internally within your organization, how are your HR functions working? And then it's about stepping back and saying, okay, what's happening in the external market that also has impact? And I will tell you, historically, over the last 10 years, a lot of HR organizations could be really internally focused on what especially in growth mode, what needs to happen. But there are some very new things that are happening in the external market, as I'm sure you all are aware of, that are really kind of changing the landscape from an HR perspective. And so I will share some of that along the way as we go through these topics, but keep in mind, sometimes it's the opportunities and threats that organizations don't take as much time to think about in the HR space, and those can present some of your biggest challenges. With that in mind, a couple of things that we're going to talk about when we look at our SWOT analysis. The big question is, where do you start? So the first place you need to start isn't always the coolest place or the sexiest place, but it's compliance. But it is the most important place to start from an HR perspective. Are you in compliance with your state, federal and local laws? And do you have a good understanding of what those are and the implications for how you're running your business? Now, unfortunately, a lot of organizations stop there and say, all right, we got to compliance. But really good organizations, organizations that truly are being strategic about the culture that they're creating, how their people engage at work, and how their HR work ties to their strategic initiatives, go way beyond compliance. And instead, they start to look at, okay, I've got compliance covered, but that's my minimum bar. What are the foundational HR practices that need to happen in order for us to run well? In order for us to not feel like we're drinking through the fire hose, or we're literally running out around every day, reacting to employee issues and not really aligning with our strategic plan. So once we get past compliance, we can start to focus on these foundational HR practices and put the infrastructure in place to support a growing organization. So we'll spend some time talking about what are those things and what do they look like when you're doing them well. Then we get into the really fun part of HR. This is where I love to nerd out, is when we can take that one step further, because we have compliance covered, because we have a strong foundation and strong infrastructure, we're now in a position to actually look at this in terms of what are our best practices and can we take this to the next level and achieve what we refer to as HR excellence. And then there's obviously, you all are all in a space where, as though it wasn't important for every organization to think about diversity, equity, inclusion, and accessibility, you all even more so need to make sure that your cultures align with your missions around social justice. And so have you taken care of things internally to create a culture of belonging, which is even more than just saying we have good HR practices. And so we're going to walk through what are the questions you need to ask yourself? What are the key things that you need to look at in each of these 4 categories so that you can build that HR strategy and fill in the items on that SWOT analysis? Some of this, especially on the compliance side, there's pieces that are going to be really kind of down into the weeds. And some of it may be, honestly, some of you will say I don't even know what that is. First of all, use your chat. Let me know that, and I'll be happy to give a better explanation. And also, if not, again, I can take these conversations offline because some of these could be presentations in and of themselves. So Humberto set up a high expectation for all things in an hour and a half, but we're going to get to a lot of it. So with that as context, I'm going to jump in and ask and just go through what are the questions in each of these sections you need to be thinking about and what do they mean? And again, we're going to put in some best practices along the way to make sure that we're good to go there. All right, so with that in mind, let's jump into our first section, compliance. It doesn't sound cool. It doesn't sound fun. It's honestly the piece that why most people go, oh, I don't want to do HR. The great part about compliance is when we get it in place and get it right on the front end, then everything else goes much more smoothly. So it is a minimum bar, but it's an important minimum bar. And honestly, more often than not, I find that when organizations aren't in compliance, it's not because they blatantly intended to get it wrong. They just didn't know. And there are a lot of complexities to HR compliance. We're going to talk about some of the most common areas where we see compliance issues with organizations who are trying to do things right and just didn't know, so that you can go back and kind of use this as your checklist. The whole idea with these slides, I'm not going to get into every single word on this slide, so don't worry. But the idea is you can use these slides as a checklist to go back to your organization and think, are we where we need to be, particularly as it relates to compliance? So let's dive into some of the items on that checklist. And again, we're not going to go through every one of these, but I'm going to give you some of the most common pitfalls that I see organizations hit. The first one is your employee handbook. First of all, do you have one? If the answer to that is no, or the answer to that is yes, but it's not really accurate, or even yes, but it's been at least 18 months since you've looked at it, this one needs to be at the top of your compliance list. We're going to dive a little bit deeper into handbooks in a couple of slides, but this one is particularly important. And if you haven't added an appendix for COVID-19, hate to tell you that because I hate saying that word now in webinars, but we definitely need to make sure that it has some of these key pieces you need for COVID-19. What's your vaccination policy? What's your vaccination tracing policy? Even if you don't do these things, you still need to have in writing what you do and what you don't do, because OSHA has now gotten involved. And so you need to make sure that you can have all of this in a document, but you don't want to have it in your handbook. You want it an appendix, because things change so quickly with this one that you don't want to have to update your handbook daily. A couple of other places on this slide that I commonly see folks run into pitfalls is FLSA in the bottom left-hand corner. Now, at least some of you are going, FLSA, Katie, this sounds like alphabet soup. And don't worry, I'm going to give you a little bit of background. The Fair Labor Standards Act is what FLSA relates to. The easiest way I can explain FLSA in a nutshell is what percentage of your people are exempt or non-exempt. And if you're still going, don't know what those mean either, think in terms of what percentage of your people are eligible for overtime versus not. Now, a couple of signs that maybe you don't have, this one is one that is often done incorrectly in companies and almost always unintentionally. If I ask a client, what percentage of your folks are exempt or non-exempt? Oftentimes they look at me on the screen like, tell me more. And I'll say, how many people do you pay overtime to versus not? And they go, oh, don't worry about that. Everybody on our team is salaried, so we don't have to pay overtime. If you're thinking that's the answer, this is the first place you need to put a circle on your checklist, because you need to go back and learn more about the Fair Labor Standards Act. Fair Labor Standards Act is a fairly detailed rule around what is considered exempt and non-exempt. And there's lots of pieces and parts to it, but it's really important that you get it right. And if everybody on your team is exempt, there's no way you have this information right. So that's your first flag. Beyond that, start to look for things like if you have administrative assistant positions on your staff, if you have a receptionist on your staff, if you have an accounts payable or accounts receivable person on your staff, and they are paid salary and they do not get overtime, they're likely misclassified. So those are ones that you're going to want to highlight and get more information. The good news is I have a full webinar just on FLSA. So if you send me a follow-up after this, I will be happy to get that information to you. But those are some early cues that we might not have FLSA compliance buttoned up. And I will tell you, if you're in that bucket, don't feel bad. I've had companies that have been in business for 40, 50 years, and they found out during one of these sessions that they didn't have it right. It's an easy thing to fix, but it's an important thing to fix. If you don't fix it, it has liability to it. It has cost to it. You really want to make sure you get this buttoned up and get the exemptions correct on the front end. The next piece on this one that I talk about is your I-9 forms. The I-9 forms are something that most companies know they need to do, so they typically have them done. This is the form that you fill out. You have to have it filled out within 3 days of the start of somebody's employment, and it needs to verify that you have seen the documents that prove that the individuals are eligible to work in the United States. There's a couple of things, though, about I-9 forms and how companies go about it that often create compliance issues. So we want to just touch on them quickly. First and foremost, where you store your I-9 forms. Many companies will just take the I-9 form and put it in the employee file along with everything else in the employee file. It's probably in a drawer locked somewhere. I-9 forms need to be kept separate from the rest of your employee documentation. They can all be in one folder. So you literally should have one folder that has everybody's I-9 form in it from beginning to end. Also, you need to make sure that the person that's filling out the I-9 form for your company, so the employer section of it that's getting filled out, has to be filled out by the person who actually saw the documents. So sometimes if you have people in the field, we will have situations where the field person looks at the document, sends it to the office, and then the office person fills it out and signs it. It's actually not technically in compliance from an I-9 perspective, and you'll want to make sure that you've got that piece buttoned up. The 3-day rule is one that's so often missed, so make sure you've got them signing it within 3 days of their hire. And those are really kind of the key pieces on the I-9 form. Make sure you're filling it out correctly, though. And for those of you who are, you're probably thinking, well, Katie, that's really crazy. It's not that hard. It is not that hard, but it is really important. And some clients I will go in and I will ask to see a sample of their I-9 so we can do a quick audit. And they will only have the front side of the I-9 or the first page, which is where the employee fills out their basic information, their address, their legal status to work in the United States, those pieces. But they don't have what we refer to as either page 2 or the back side of the I-9. And this is where you actually have to fill in their information on the passport or from the driver's license or from their visa, if that's their legal status. So just make sure you have both pieces taken care of. Somebody just put a comment in the chat that said, we recently started using E-Verify. Is it okay to leave the I-9 in the HRIS, or do you need to download and keep them separately? If you have an HRIS system, yay, that is a huge piece of your HR system. And I strongly encourage, if you don't have one, we'll talk about during this presentation where the benefit to getting one is. If you have it, your I-9 in your HRS, you can leave it there. You don't have to print it separately. But if you have it in paper format, it can't be in the same file folder with all of the other information that you have from an HR perspective. So feel free to do both pieces. Just make sure that even if you do E-Verify, you still need to make sure you've got your I-9. Again, if you have questions on either FLSA or I-9s, pop those into the chat. I'll be happy to take those. We're going to dive a little deeper into job descriptions and employee handbooks in a few slides. So I'm going to make sure we keep moving. One quick note on harassment training. Several states across the country have now made harassment training mandatory. So if you are, so please be sure that you're aware of that, whether or not your state requires it, and make sure you have that set up and ready to go. A couple that I can tell you right offhand, I think there's about 11 or 12 now that have mandated it. New York, Illinois, California have all put it in as a requirement, and there's a few additional ones that are part of that as well. But it's fairly easy to get that info. So if you're not sure if it's mandated, make sure to check that, check your status there, or reach out to us. We'll be happy to tell you what that looks like as well. So page 2 of our checklist starts to talk about some other key, again, lots of alphabet soup in the HR space, but we want to make sure you've got some good understanding of when do these things apply. So I-9s and Fair Labor Standards Act applies to every organization. So just so you know, like there's no getting around those two. Every single company has to do those regardless of size. If you are large enough that you've gotten to 50 employees, then you are required to make sure that you have family medical leave in place. That's our FMLA on the right-hand side of the checklist. It's 50 or more employees at the federal level. Some states have a lower number at the state level, so make sure you understand your state level requirements on that. But family medical leave essentially says you're required to ensure that someone's job is not in jeopardy if they have to take a leave of absence. It doesn't necessarily require that it be paid medical leave. Again, that depends more state by state, but the federal level just says you have to make sure you hold somebody's job for 12 or more weeks in a rolling period. If you are 50 or more people and you don't have a process around your FMLA tracking, need to get that in place, because this is one that you have to have there's a lot of paperwork and a lot of things you have to have documented to make sure that you get that correct. So in addition to that, COBRA is 20 or more employees, as well as ACA, which is the Affordable Care Act. So this gets to your benefit type information. You want to make sure you've got these pieces buttoned up. Affordable Care Act is, make sure you have, if you are 20 more employees, you need to make sure you have a plan in place for individuals. Also, make sure that your plans are in compliance. I just had a client last week where she said, oh, well, Susie needs benefits, but Joe didn't. So we got Joe a plan, but not Susie. Can't do that. If you're going to have plans, they have to be consistent across the class type. So you may have different classes within your organization, but you have to be consistent. You can't sort of cherry pick this person by person. That's probably one of the most common mistakes. The COBRA, which is continuation of benefits. So I leave your employment. I had coverage with you. I'm eligible to continue it. I just have to pay for it on my own. There are a ton of compliance requirements with COBRA. If you are 20 or more employees and you are trying to manage COBRA by yourself, I strongly encourage you to look at a third-party administrator and get them on board. And I can say that, and it's not a sales tip because we don't even do third-party administrator, and I would tell you to go get a third-party administrator. There are a lot of fines, penalties with missed COBRA deadlines, and it's really easy to miss one. So if you use a third-party administrator and they miss the deadline, they have to pay the fine. If you miss the deadline, you end up paying it. So always encourage people. It's complicated, and if you have more than 20 people, it's just easier for somebody else to do it for you. It's also not expensive, which is the other reason it's helpful. The bottom left-hand corner, 1099 versus W-2. How do you classify your employees? This is one that is commonly mishandled. A lot of folks go, oh, I just need them to do some work here and there. They're doing occasional project work, so I'm just going to make them 1099 versus making them a W-2 employee. You need to make sure you have this classification right from an IRS perspective. And there are 15 states in the country where it is really hard for somebody to qualify as a 1099 because they have introduced the concept of the ABC rule, which says that if the contractor is doing the business that the business is in, they cannot be 1099. So I'll use a really simple example, painters. Many, and I know you all are nonprofit, but this is as basic as I can make it to make this make sense. If I own a painting company and I am sending painters out to do the painting, it used to be really common practice that I could just have a whole bunch of 1099 contractors and just pay them job by job. In these 15 states, I can't do that anymore because those painters are doing the work that my business exists to do, so they have to be W-2. And so there are very infrequent times when 1099 can work in those states. So make sure you've got this one right. Again, if you're wrong, the penalties and interest can be kind of challenging. And also how you're treating 1099s. Do you require them to come to meetings? Do you require them to be there from 8 to 5? All of these things fall into whether or not somebody is appropriately classified as 1099. I know that sounds super in the weeds and nitty gritty, but here's why it's important. Growing organizations, we need to come up with creative ways to staff and creative ways to fill the needs in a hurry. And so sometimes that tends to be like, oh, great, let's just do a contractor and get that done and get over with. And in the moment, it seems like a great idea. But again, this is a more common problem in a growing organization where we're moving 1,000,000 miles an hour only to find out we've misclassified somebody and we need to get it fixed. So I wanted to make sure we talked about it here today. Make sure that you have it on your radar if you do have any folks in that category. Make sure you've taken a look at your interview applications. If you have individuals that are filling out an application for any reason, you absolutely want to make sure you don't have any illegal questions on there. And there's a lot of questions that we think are really just basic things that are now illegal. And including one of which in many states that is a new one is the felony question can be a legal issue in many states. And the additional one is if I ask what your current salary is or your prior salary was, that can also now be an illegal question if it is a state that requires you not to ask about current salary, but instead about desired salary. So you want to make sure you've got all of your interview questions kind of buttoned up, both on paper and in what you ask in the interviews. All right, a couple of the last items on our compliance checklist, and then I promise we get into stuff that's way more fun than compliance. A couple of things to be thinking about that make a big difference. COVID is a key piece of this. We cannot get away from the COVID compliance, and you want to be really buttoned up. It doesn't mean you have to have a vaccination policy. It doesn't mean you have to pay PTO, but whatever you've decided to do, you need to put it in writing. And so think about whether or not, have you decided now that the FFCRA paid sick leave has run out, do you have a policy for if somebody has to be quarantined? Do they have to use their PTO? Do you have a separate paid time off bank? How do you set that up? How much time do they need? Make sure if you have changed to a telecommuting organization or are hybrid in many ways, I have so many clients right now that are updating their handbooks because everything used to talk about, we will be in person, you will be in person. Their equipment policies were about being in person. And now they have no intention of going back to an office, or now they have employees that live in totally different states. Your handbooks need to match what's happening in your organization today. So you want to make sure you get this piece taken care of. Also, your tracking of vaccination status. This only matters if people are in person, but if they are in person, it becomes really important. Again, you do not have to mandate vaccinations, people to be vaccinated. But if you have people meeting in person, you want to make sure that you know who is vaccinated and who is not fully vaccinated, because it impacts the quarantine rules and the contact tracing rules. So for you to follow OSHA guidelines, you have to be sure you know what to do based on who reports being sick and who was around other people. So it's an awkward question. There's easy ways to track it, but make sure that you aren't just ignoring this because it's an uncomfortable question. Make sure that you've got what you need to be able to administer all of the rules. I will tell you, COVID has been one of the biggest challenges, particularly for smaller organizations that up until now, like, just kind of ran and everybody could do their own, like, do what they always did and try to treat people well, and it made life easy. And that changes a bit with COVID. We can still try to do all of the right things, but these kinds of rules and laws apply to small businesses in ways that probably didn't historically have quite so much regulation and oversight. So make sure you know your rules, make sure you're doing the right things, and most importantly, make sure you have documents and processes so that everybody knows what to expect. All right, so that is the beginning of your compliance checklist. I said we would dive a bit into job descriptions and employee handbooks. If anybody has questions on any of the items on the checklist I didn't talk about, now is a perfect time to throw those in the chat while I'm talking about job descriptions and giving you some best practices in that space. So here's the thing. When we think of job descriptions, many of us think about, oh, you know what? We've got this pile of job descriptions. They're sitting in a drawer. Maybe they're covered in cobwebs. I've had one client that brought them to me. If you're in my generation, you remember what ditto paper was. And I am not kidding you. She showed up in the meeting with a ditto papered job description. If job descriptions are simply sitting in a drawer and they're only intended for you to use for legal compliance, you're not getting the most out of them. They absolutely relate to legal compliance and you need them for compliance purposes, but there's so much more you could be getting out of them. And so they are a fundamental tool for what we do in HR. First thing they do is they set clear expectations for employees. They make sure that we're aligned on what are you supposed to be doing and what are your priorities. They also become a coaching tool for how are you doing and how are you progressing in this role and what does the next role look like for you. So when we have good job descriptions, we're looking at them minimum quarterly and probably more frequently than that to make sure that they're accurate, they reflect what's happening, and we're coaching to them. In addition, job descriptions are part of partially compliance because they help you in so many ways as it relates to workers' comp, family medical leave, the Americans with Disabilities Act, which comes into play if you have 25 or more employees, and the Fair Labor Standards exemptions, which again covers everybody. So there's 4 major laws that you need job descriptions for, and yet many organizations don't have these. If you do them well, they go beyond just helping you in these 4 major laws. And we're going to talk about what does that mean to do them well. But make sure you've got a good base to have these going forward. So what does it mean to have a good job description? Most of you go, I've got job descriptions. I have a piece of paper that says job title, list of the 100 things this person is responsible for, the qualifications they need to do the job, what's the work environment look like, and a disclaimer signature. Now, some of you go, work environment? I don't have anything about work environment. Some people may not have a disclaimer and a signature, but these are the 5 sections you want to make sure your job description has. But what we're going to change for you is the second piece of job duties. So many companies, the reason their job descriptions sit in a drawer and collect dust is because job duties ends up being the list of the 100 things that somebody is responsible for. And while it gives them general direction, it's not particularly helpful, both from a coaching side and from a compliance side. So instead of the list of the 100 things that somebody is responsible for, we actually recommend that you think of job descriptions in terms of what are the top 4 to 5 buckets, big buckets, high level concepts that somebody is responsible for accomplishing in this role. And then what percentage of time should they spend in each of those 4 to 5 big buckets? Now, under each bucket, you're going to put in some nitty-gritty detail to explain what that actually means and to make sure that how they're going to spend their day-to-day accomplishing that is in there. But you really want to start not with a list of 100 things, but the 4 to 5 big buckets. So if I use this as an example, if we have a position that is a team leader position, say in a call center environment, for purposes of this example, but in any environment, team leader position, 60% of that person's space is still answering the phones. They've got to answer the phones, take customer calls. 20% of their time is leading the people on their team, 10% is doing QA, and 10% is updating the systems. This is really important because say I end up with a disability, I get injured at work, and the doctor says to me, you know what, Katie, you can't be on the phones. Well, that's 60% of my job. So it makes a difference as to whether or not I can return to work, whether this is covered under work comp. It's important from that perspective. On the flip side, if the thing that they tell me I can do means I can't type on a regular basis or as fast as I need to, well, then that's just going to slow down maybe updating systems. And that's only 10%. So not that big of a deal. So having these high level buckets helps make decisions when somebody can't work. But it also, more importantly, says, you know what, maybe you have a team leader who loves to spend time with their team and they're spending 60% of their time there, which means they're only available 20% of the time for phone calls. That's a problem in performance. So these percentages both help with compliance, but they also help have conversations around where are you spending your time and is it the right percentage for the role that you play in the organization? And these shift over time. And so especially for a growing organization, maybe when we started, this person's time was 60% was supposed to be with customers and 20% with team, but maybe their team has doubled in size. And this has to start to switch. Well, we need to make sure that we're all aligned in what that looks like. And we also have to make sure they have the skills to do it well. So if you have job descriptions, still make sure you've switched your formatting and thought about this in terms of not just the list of 100 things, but more importantly, what am I setting as expectations and how does it align with where I really want somebody spending their time? Employee handbooks. So employee handbooks, we think of them as being 100% about compliance. We also think about them in terms of like boring, written by the attorney, and most of the time we can't even understand the words on the page. If you or one of your employees can't sit down and read the employee handbook from beginning to end and understand what it was intended to tell you, you've missed the mark with your handbook. Your handbook should be all about not just, there are some pieces that have to be compliance, but your handbook should be the thing that employees refer back to, first of all, when they're first starting, but on an ongoing basis to say, what's the culture we're going for? I always try to describe handbooks as there's the parts that are legal compliance, but so much more of it in an ideal space is about, it's the guardrails that tell an employee, this is the environment and the culture we want. How do you operate within it? And it should be something they're looking at often enough because when they have questions, it's a great place to go. So it has to define your company culture and it has to match your company culture. It has to have your vision, mission, and values embedded. And then of course, it has to be compliant with state, local, federal, and OSHA regulations. But if you don't have all three components, then you just have a piece of paper that sounds like wah, 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 wah. And we don't want that because we actually want our employees to look at these things. A couple of best practices around employee handbooks is, first of all, limit the legal speak. Use plain language so that when people read it, they get what you're trying to accomplish. Also, check your acknowledgement statement. A lot of statements at the back, when you sign off on your employee handbook, will say things like, I have read and understand. And you can't prove that they read it and you can't prove that somebody understood it. So instead, you want the language to say, I understand I am responsible for the content. So you can prove that they knew they were responsible for it. You can't prove that they understood it. And so small language change, but check the last page of your employee handbook and make sure that you have this right. This has changed over the last couple of years in terms of nuances based on some court rulings. So it's a really good practice to go back and double check where you're at. Also, spend time making sure that what you put in your employee handbook is what you actually do. If you sit down with new hires and you are going over that handbook and you get to a section and you're like, oh yeah, that doesn't apply anymore. Oh no, we don't really do it that way. Then you need to rewrite your handbook and you need to do it quickly. The reality is every time you say ignore that part of the handbook, you have actually undermined the entire handbook, because the courts would tell you, how am I supposed to as an employee know which ones I'm supposed to ignore and which ones I'm not? So make sure that it's accurate reflection of what you're doing. Do not pull one of these down off of the internet and just try to use it yourself. I guarantee somebody put something in there that you're like, oh no, that's not what we do. Do make sure you go over this with each of your employees. And we've got in person, but in person has a really broad definition. In person can be via Zoom. It can be in person, like literally we sit next to each other. But no matter what you do, you want to make sure that you don't just send these things out and hope that people are reading it and have them sign things. Make sure you highlight what's important and particularly speak to why it's important. It should all come back to, it's important because of my company culture, because of our vision, because of our mission. If your mission and your policies aren't connected, then people are going to be like, why do we have that particular policy? One of the things we see companies doing more and more is using video for their handbooks. This gives it some life because somebody is actually talking to them about the employee handbook. And it's a great way to make sure that you're really getting to not just we have a bunch of policies because the attorney said so, but instead because we want to make sure that this helps you understand our values, our culture, and the kind of environment we want you to have every day. All right, so take a deep breath. That was compliance through a fire hose. So take a breath there. If you have any questions on the compliance piece of your strategy, and again, what you want to be doing when you're thinking about your strategy is go through those checklist items and say, what are the things we're doing really well? Where don't we have something in place? What kinds of threats did we see? And those become the first part of your HR strategy. But remember, we said early on, the compliance piece is minimal bar. We're going to take HR to a whole new level because you guys are growing. And in growth comes the opportunity to really make the people side of your business what sets you apart and also allows you to meet those mission and values that you're looking for in your organization. There's nothing worse than working for an organization where they have this great, meaningful, impactful mission, and everybody is like really bought into what the organization is trying to do. And yet they run into frustrations on the HR side because they can't do some of the simple things. Share a quick example. I had a client a couple of years ago that was in the space. They actually were part of like they were an organ donor bank, right? So huge mission, real passion for the good that they were doing in the world from all of their employees. But they had policies in place. They didn't have an employee handbook. Instead, they had 72 individual policies related to employment. And those policies got pushed out through a database on an annual basis, but they all had different dates. And you had 30 days to sign each one of them. So on any given day, you had to read a policy that ended with, and if you violate this policy, it could result in discipline up to and including termination. So almost every day of the year, you had to read a sentence that said, by the way, I might fire you. And yet you were supposed to be passionate about their mission. You really have to make sure that the way we approach HR isn't just about we checked a box, but does it match the value that you want your team to have from being part of your team? Does it match the culture and the things that you're saying are important to you? That's when we get into things like, do our foundational tools work for us? And more importantly, when we get to HR excellence. So diving into this, what I would challenge you to do next, after you get through compliance, if you're past that and you're thinking our compliance is in good shape, then we start to pivot to our employee life cycle. You need to think about employment as a life cycle, and every employee is in a different place in this particular life cycle. We start with workforce planning. How many people do you need and in what roles? And it goes all the way through to engagement on a day-to-day basis. And what does it mean when somebody leaves the organization? Organizations that do this well are actually looking at every part of their employee experience and saying what's working well and what's detracting from the outcome that we want our employees to have. So with that, we're going to dive into each of these quickly. Umberto, we have a poll, I think, real quick. We have a poll on the compliance piece, right? On how folks were feeling, or is it on this one? I felt like I skipped a slide somewhere.
Yep, we have a poll.
I apologize for that. All of a sudden I was like, I think I skipped one. There we go. Let's go ahead and jump in just so that I've got compliance wrapped up. Let's put up a poll here for, on a scale of 1 to 10, based on what we shared, how are you feeling about your compliance issues? 1 to 3 is we have a long way to go. 4 to 6, we've got some pieces, but we still have work. And then the 7 to 10 is we're in great shape. Humberto, if you want to share those, once you get enough results, if you want to share those on your end.
And I'll actually ask Brenda if she can share, but what it looks like is that we have 72% in the 4 to 6 range saying we have some pieces right, but still have some work to do. We have 8% that has a long way to go, so that's is good. And then we have a 20% in the 7 to 10 range. So again, 72 seems to be the majority of the 4 to 6 range.
Great, that's great. And again, that feels good based on the target of the conversations we were looking to have. That was about what I would have expected. And again, if you're in the 1 to 3, don't panic. It's likely, easy shifts that can kind of get you where you need to go, and lots of support to be able to do that. So we're going to pivot and we're going to talk about employee life cycle and see then where folks feel like they are in this piece. So what you want to do is do your SWOT analysis on each of the stages of your employee life cycle. These are things like starts with workforce planning. Now, many of you on this one are going, they're supposed to be planning for this. Good organizations sit down on a regular basis and try to predict as best as we can when we're going through crazy growth. What positions do we think we need in the organization? How many of them do we need? And when do they need to come on board? This planning allows you to set up a recruiting strategy, as opposed to feeling like recruiting is something always reactive that you're just chasing. Instead, it's about how do you plan up front, which changes the kinds of things you do in recruiting. If I know I need 10 people by September, well, now I start to build a pipeline for those people versus waking up in August and going, I'll try a job posting and see what happens. Also, you want to make sure when you do your workforce planning that you're looking at things like turnover, growth projections, succession planning. If you are in growth mode and you're looking at staffing just in terms of what openings do we have today, going to always end up being behind the 8 ball. So look further out and you'll get much better outcomes out of your recruiting strategies. Because when you understand what you need to hire, now you can actually create an employment brand that fits the amount of hiring that you need to do. Do you have sourcing plans? Do you have a well-defined selection process? And we're going to talk about some best practices of what this looks like. Do you have a positive candidate experience? I will tell you, particularly in today's job market, if you do not have an ideal candidate experience, boy, do we need to do some work here. The labor market is painful. I spent 12 years at Progressive Insurance as the director of recruiting for their claims and contact centers. We hired 8,000 to 10,000 people a year, and I did that for 12 years. And I will be the first to tell you, I thought I had seen every labor market out there. I've seen nothing like what we have been going through for the last year and a half. So if you don't have your candidate experience buttoned up, you're going to lose out on the candidates you want, and you're ultimately going to end up not being able to attract the right talent. Are your interviewers trained? That's partially candidate experience, but also in your all space as it relates to social justice. Do your interviewers even understand how unconscious bias and things like that can impact their own decision-making in the interview process? And are you helping them understand how to overcome that to make sure that you really are bringing in not only a diverse workforce, but then you're creating an inclusive environment for people. You really need to make sure you've got a strong hiring process. Need to define it up front so that you can get the quality of person you want in the shortest period of time you can get it. You keep from having any legal issues, and at the same time, candidate experience matters, because if you think about it from a turnover perspective, I just went through this whole process with you where you're trying to encourage me to come take a job. If I don't treat you well there, what impression do I have of how you will treat me when I'm an employee? So if I have a poor candidate experience, people don't respond to me, I get left out in the cold for 3 weeks and nobody tells me what's going on. I get somebody else's offer letter. I've had that happen first. I've had that happen to people. If these kinds of things happen before I get there, then in week 1, week 2, week 3, when there will be bumps in the onboarding process, because there always are, I'm really quick to be like, maybe this wasn't such a good idea. So you want to make sure you've got all of this buttoned up and that you've got somebody managing your hiring process from beginning to end to make sure this is great outcomes. Also, if you are posting job descriptions to entice people to come work for you, you need to take them down and you need to replace them with job ads. They need to be marketing your company. This should be truly a marketing and advertising piece, not a here's the list of 100 things you're going to do. Why should I want to come work for you? Why, as a candidate, what's in it for me? Not, and by the way, here's the list of the 100 qualifications you must meet in order for you to even want me to apply. Pull me in, draw me in. You can always figure out later whether I'm not the right candidate, but in this market, you need to be pulling in as many people as you can. Then when you get into your process, make sure you know what you're looking for in the best candidate. Make sure you understand motivational interest and motivational fit. So again, this goes back to training your hiring managers, but when we say somebody's not a right fit, it shouldn't be about some gut feel. It should be about what does this person like to do and what do they hate to do in comparison to how often they will do it in this particular job. How many times have you had somebody who loved to do something and they never got to do it? And they very quickly are like, oh, this isn't very fun. Or they had to do the thing every single day that they're like, this isn't the thing I like doing. They're going to burn out. So when you think about motivational fit, how are you getting information in your interview process to get to this? It all comes down to having really good interview guides, and your interview guides being about behavioral-based interviewing. Here's the thing though, a lot of you go, oh, we do that. So many companies, if you have not trained somebody on how to do behavioral-based interviewing, it becomes all about, oh, that's the question HR told me I have to ask. Tell me about a time when. Good interviewers, it's not about the question they ask, it's about them understanding what they're listening for. And there is an art to behavioral-based interviewing. It is not about the question, it's about what you're listening for in their answer. So make sure you've taken time to train your interviewers so that they do know what they're actually listening for. One quick piece on compliance, if you are running background checks, please make sure you are using a reputable background check vendor. Again, I can say that because we don't do background checks. I have suggestions, but we don't do them. But there is a very complex law called the Fair Credit Reporting Act that has all sorts of rules around what you need to notify a candidate of when you're doing a background check. This includes the background check we don't do, but we look at Facebook and we look at CaseNet or other tools. You have to make sure what you're doing is in compliance with the FCRA. So be really cautious. If you're doing background checks, formally or informally, make sure that you're doing this the right way. Again, quick look at your hiring process, right? But key is if you can't tell somebody, here is what the process is going to look like, then you don't have it buttoned up. And if you're deciding that position by position, you likely don't have a candidate experience that's going to really entice people to want to work there. So make sure you've got this component really clear. And then you get them, yay, we finally have our new hire. How do you make sure they have an onboarding experience that really sets the tone for aligning with your mission and vision and values and getting integrated into the team and being in an inclusive environment where people feel like they belong? Big piece of this is have a plan. So many clients are like, we're onboarding a new person, and the plan covers, give them their tax forms, give them their direct deposit form, make sure that they're set up in the systems, and then like, oh, I'll introduce you to people. Your onboarding plan should cover their first 6 months with the organization. And most importantly, you need to think about what's the goal of the onboarding plan. It's not just fill out your tax form, it's understand the mission and vision, build relationships with key stakeholders, make sure that they know expectations and have the coaching and feedback they need. You need to make sure that you have a plan and that it's getting executed on. And then we've got ongoing performance management. So many times we think of performance management as the performance evaluation. We encourage folks, get away from performance evaluations. They're cumbersome, managers hate them, and employees hate them. So why do we keep doing them? Instead, get rid of some of the documents and think about how do you put coaching conversations in place. These are much more manageable, they're much more engaging, and most importantly, people will actually do them and you'll get real meaningful outcomes. But do you have anything in place? Do people even get feedback? And when they get the feedback, do they know they're getting feedback, and do they know why? So make sure one of the pieces you need to check in on is, do we have performance management tools in place? In an ideal space, you literally are meeting with people at a minimum quarterly. I have some clients that do this monthly, and we're talking about a couple of key basic things. What should this person start doing, stop doing, and continue doing? And that is as basic. I have all of my team members, they've never seen a performance evaluation from me at all. But we sit down, we meet weekly to talk about the challenges and obstacles right in front of them. And then on a quarterly basis, we stop and we ask, they come prepared to answer, and I come prepared to talk about what is it I'd like to see you start doing, stop doing, and continue doing. And therein, we have a way to coach and develop. And it's part of an ongoing, consistent conversation. Now, that being said, coaching conversations, a couple of key things that you want to make sure. First of all, focus on the conversation, not the document. Make sure it's future oriented. It should not be about rehashing, here are the 10 things you did last quarter. Instead, it's about, here's what we'd like to focus on going forward. Most companies, though, need to do them more frequently. So make sure, again, quarterly at a minimum is really going to get you results. Again, it's not about compliance, about getting results. Let's jump into, again, feel free if you've got questions, throw those in the chat. I know this is a ton of information, but we really wanted to make sure you had some good things. So hopefully everybody's getting good takeaways out of this. Let's jump into compensation practices. This one is key. You have, especially in today's market, strong compensation policies and practices are critical to both attracting the right talent and retaining your talent. And so many organizations, when they grow, you've hired people here and there, and you're like, okay, Susie needs at least 60,000 and Joey needs 120. And like, we just bring people on. Question you have to ask yourself is, do you have a compensation philosophy? And if you do, can you articulate it? And even more importantly, could your employees tell you what it is? And most of you are thinking, there's a philosophy to this, and there really is. There is a goal for how you approach compensation. Do you want to be paying at the highest end of the market for your base salaries? And you know what? You want mostly to be base and no bonus? Do you want to be paying kind of mid-range, competitive, but not crazy, but you think benefit packages are the most important thing because maybe it aligns with your mission? There's all sorts of reasons that different companies have different compensation philosophies, but you first have to answer, what is that for you? And it almost always should tie back to your mission, your vision, and your values of the organization. And who do you need to attract and retain for the positions that you have? Because different people will care about different things. I will use one of the examples for my own team. I have a team of 7 folks. They're all in exempt level positions, so they're not technically eligible for overtime. I could pay it if I wanted to. I don't have to, but I need them sometimes to work more than 40 hours a week. I want to make sure they're rewarded for that when we grow a lot fast, so they have to do it more often because I need to keep up with capacity. But at the same time, I don't want to pay them hourly. We don't want that, we don't want them to be in hourly positions if we don't have to. I came up with a bonus program that I based on what I think on average they would likely have to work if we worked overtime. What does that look like when we do on average? And now if we grow enough that they're having to work more than 40 hours a week on a consistent basis, that bonus pool is out there so that I pay that at the end of the year and we all get to celebrate that we had a great year. And yeah, we had to work a little harder, but we had a great year. Now, I also though built it not for a huge number because guess what? My employees actually value work-life balance. So they'd rather to have a smaller bonus, but me have the money to be able to bring on more people so that they don't have to work 10 hours of overtime a week. We had that conversation. We built it into the philosophy. It's built into the plan. So you have to understand your target audience, your mission, your vision and values, and how all of that comes together. There was a question here on performance management and I didn't miss it. I will come back to it. I want to wrap up compensation, but I'll come back and grab that question here in just a second. So once you know your compensation philosophy, now you need to figure out what does that really mean? You can do market analysis. So looking at the external market, there are salary survey data out there. There's actually really good salary survey data in the nonprofit space that you can understand what is the market competition to be able to pay different roles. And you can decide for yourself, do we want to be in the 10th percentile, the 25th, the 70th? Where's the right benchmark for us based on what the talent you need, how much talent you need, and most importantly, kind of where you fall from a budget perspective. But knowing it allows you to explain to your employees, here's why we've set your compensation where we did. Also making sure you take into your benefits plan as part of that. If you're not big enough and you're not offering health insurance, then you definitely need to make sure you're at the higher level on the compensation side. If you offer a really great benefits package, then you might be able to make that adjustment for base because you've got a total comp and a total rewards program. Use market surveys to figure those things out. The ideal world, you actually you do a market comparison, you set ideal ranges, and then you can start to be in a position to talk to employees about, here's the value you bring to the organization, here is your performance, and here's how that ties to how you are compensated in comparison to the market. And now your employees feel like there is transparency around why salaries are what they are. And it'll also allows you to be equitable in your salaries across the organization. It doesn't just reward somebody for being a better negotiator. There was a question here on performance. How and when do you talk about those 10 things you did wrong last month? Ideally, we're talking about it in the moment. So when we're doing coaching conversations, it's why frequency matters. Ideally, those 10 things, we don't wait until there's 10. We're meeting, again, if I use my team as an example, we meet weekly, not to say what's on your to-do list, but instead to say, what obstacles are you running into? What support or resources do you need? More importantly, what did we learn last week? I had an employee who had, they had a client issue fall apart on them last week. And instead of in the moment being like, you did this wrong, I said, you know what? Let's talk about how did you feel that went? She was like, that was a disaster. I was like, okay, good. We're on the same page. And I said, you know what? I could sit here and tell you where I think it went wrong, but you will learn more if you come back next week and think about, if you could go back to the beginning, what would you do differently? Now that you know what you know, what would you do differently? And how do we apply that to the next time? That's coaching versus disciplining. That's the ideal space. Now, sometimes we coach and it's time to go to, you're not catching the coaching. You're not getting it. You're not in the right role for you. That's when we go to performance management and we start. The good part is we have notes that say we've had these coaching conversations all along. They're not novels. They're not 10 pages of notes, but it's, hey, on Monday, I had a conversation with Susie. We talked about this client and this issue. Here's what we agreed we were going to do going forward. And then when it gets to a point that you've realized this is a trend and we need to address it, now we actually start with the discipline process. But not every employee should ever see that you even have a discipline process. It's only for those situations where you're really trying to get everybody to the same page of this role isn't working for you. And so how do you have those? And then you have documented, that's when you do say, here's the things that you did that you can't do again. And if you do these again, or you don't correct these, here's what's going to happen. Your quarterly coaching conversations help that, because you're having weeklies talking about things in the moment, and then your quarterlies should help sum up, start, stop, and continue. Hopefully that answers the question and gives some best practices. I'm going to keep moving. If you need more, feel free to put it in the chat. The last two pieces here on your life cycle are your exit interviews and making sure your HRIS system really help promote your foundational structure for HR. We're going to talk about that a little bit more in depth in a couple of slides. But do make sure you have a formal exit interview process. You need to hear from people what worked really well and what didn't, because unfortunately you've already lost them, but at least you can find out if there's things you could be doing differently for the future. All right, before we jump into HR excellence, Umberto, I believe we have a one more poll to see how folks are feeling about their foundational piece. Perfect. All right. So as you look at this, what part of the employment process is your greatest strength? Go ahead and put in where you feel you are today, and we'll share those results out. Based on what we talked about, where do you feel your greatest strength is? And Humberto, if you can again share some of the leading results for us, that would be great.
Sure. So we have almost all results in, and it seems to be a fairly distributed result.
Okay.
So
yep.
I'm going to end poll and then we'll share.
Okay.
All right. So now we can see that candidate experience at 21%, onboarding at 26%, development at 11, performance management has no votes, engagement at 32, and exit process at 11.
Okay. Yes. It is not uncommon that performance management does not get a lot of votes in this space. This is that I will say it's a big challenge for organizations. And typically it's because companies are they're trying to manage this through performance evaluations versus building a coaching process that is collaborative. And also because I'll be honest, to be really good in these coaching conversations, you have to have leadership development. You have to teach people to create a culture of coaching. You have to teach your leaders, not your don't think of it as managing people. It's about developing people. It's about coaching people. It's about leading people. So have you taught your folks in leadership to lead and to coach? And that's usually a gap, especially for a growing organization. Sometimes our subject matter expert became our manager, and that may not put them in the space to be ready for leaders. So as we dive into HR excellence, I think you're going to see a little bit more in this space. But if you are finding that performance management is not a strength, I would say it's either one, process related, either there isn't one, or you're using sort of like older performance evaluation type mentality, or you have individuals that are supposed to be leading that performance management and they're acting as managers versus understanding how to step into the space as a coach. All right, so now this is where HR gets fun. Not that we haven't had fun, but so far you're doing the things you need to do to be able to have infrastructure and run well, regardless of your growth. But this HR excellence means now we can really start to integrate our HR strategies into our business needs and our business strategies. And this is where HR makes all the impact in the world. This is where HR starts to have a strategic place at the table. So when you're in HR excellence mode, you literally are aligning your business strategies with your HR strategies. You're looking at what do we need to accomplish as a business 3 years from now, and thinking about what would we need to have in place for HR infrastructure, for compensation models, for all these things in order to achieve those business results. We also are tying it back to employee engagement. So we're not just doing it because it's the right thing to do or HR best practices say we should do it, but we're actually seeing changes in engagement and in results because of it. Had one of the saddest days ever yesterday. I'm doing retention interviews for a company. We're trying to figure out why they're having so much turnover. And I met with one of their supervisors and I asked him, we're going through these interviews. And I said, we're just asking, what do people like about being here and what don't they like? And what would you change? And I said, so what do people like about being here? And he said, nothing. And I was like, well, there's something, right? He's like, no, everybody hates it. I hate it. I don't even know why I'm here. And I was like, oh, you're crushing my HR soul. So we really need to be thinking about, like, if folks are feeling that way, it's not about compliance. It's probably about something much bigger. And how do we address those things? This gets to really being strategic. Are you using engagement surveys? Do you have strategies for engaging your employees? Have you shifted those strategies because maybe now you're remote and people aren't engaging in the same way? Are you using things like leadership development, leadership assessments? Have you taken time to do workplace styles training? These are things like Everything DISC or Myers-Briggs. Do people on your team understand the styles of the other people you're working with? And how do they leverage those to make sure that, like, they're getting the best out of each person? And how do you use those to build trust so that now when I do the crazy thing I do, people know why I did it in the first place? When you've moved past compliance and infrastructure, and now you can start to get to excellence, these are the kinds of things that you can do that make a difference. Now, here's the cool part. If you go ahead and do some of these things, even if your compliance isn't all buttoned up yet, or you don't have your performance management all figured out, you will create an environment where people will want to lean in and be part of this people side and the HR side. So don't not do these until everything else is done, or you'll never get to them. But this is about thinking strategically about the HR component of what you're doing. Make sure you've planned a plan. For those of you who have a remote workforce, you've got to have strategies to get these people engaged. Now, the great part is it's not as hard as it feels like it is up front. And in fact, if you put workforce strategies in place that engage a remote workforce, they're the things you probably should have been doing all along when we were in person. We just took for granted that they needed to be quite so intentional. So these don't have to be wildly crazy or wildly innovative, but they do still, like, you have to be thoughtful about them. One of the best engagements I get for remote employees, honestly, is I've got teams. They start every Monday morning with a quick team huddle, and they start the conversation with, what were your highs and lows from last week? Because guess what? When we were all in an office together, that's how we started Monday morning anyway, right? Over the cup of coffee, over the, like, I'm walking in the door. We chatted about these things. Now we just have to be intentional about creating space for that. And while in the moment it might feel fluffy, I'll tell you, I've built an entire team of people who have never actually met each other in person, and yet they know more about each other's personal lives than people that have been in together for years. So it's all about creating the intentional moments where people can learn about each other. Workplace styles can be a big piece of that. And then also creating a leadership team that understands what it is to lead and to coach, not to manage. If you have a group of people managing and you are trying to work in a remote workforce, I guarantee you your culture is suffering from it. The last piece on HR strategies that is such a great tool and is really helpful if you don't have it, especially as a growing organization, they go hand in hand with job descriptions, but they are truly magical. And they're what we refer to as RACI charts. RACI charts are going through the key tasks that need to happen every day in your organization, from top to bottom, from strategy to we've got to fill out this form for this client, and everything in between. And deciding for all of these items that need to happen, who's responsible, who is accountable, so who does the work, who's the final decision maker, the accountable, who gets consulted, and who gets informed. And most of the time when we take teams through this, especially as an intact team conversation, what we find is inevitably there's somebody who thought they were supposed to be consulted and everybody else thought they were just supposed to be informed. Or maybe nobody's decided who the decision maker is, so everything's getting stalled. Or you've got a leader who is reluctant to delegate, so they're keeping everything for themselves and they have too much on their plate. When you take time to use this RACI chart tool, nobody ever thinks of it as an HR tool. If you've heard of it at all, it's probably from a project management perspective, but it is one of the most astonishing HR tools, especially when you do it in conjunction then and make sure job descriptions align with it. Now, individual job descriptions, which used to sit in a drawer and collect cobwebs, the RACI chart shows how those job descriptions come together and create a web for how we're going to get work done and how we're going to communicate across the organization. So if you have not done these, or if you have and they've collected cobwebs as well, make sure you go back and pull these out. Somebody asked if this is Darcy. I've not heard Darcy, but it could be. So let me research that, Hannah. If you want to drop your email in, I'll go back and take a look to see if it's another version of a similar concept. But it absolutely is one that I tell people all the time when I've got teams that are really frustrated with each other and everybody's like coming over the table at each other in meetings and so forth. 9 times out of 10, there's 2 things going on. One, the organization is missing trust, and we have to go back and use things like workplace styles and other tools to rebuild trust within the organization. And usually one of the reasons people are lacking trust is because they don't have RACI charts in place and people don't understand how their role is supposed to be integrated with the other roles in the organization. And so those are 2 pieces to just really keep an eye on as you go forward. A couple of other things in terms of sort of the strategic side of the house. There's a quick slide for you all on RACI: responsible, accountable, consulted, and informed. I do have, if folks want to email me, I do have a follow-up webinar or another webinar I have done just on RACI and how to leverage it. And if you want that as a reference document, I'm more than happy to send you that video if it would be useful to you to figure it out. Great tools. All right, let's take a moment. I want to make sure we talk about diversity, equity, inclusion, and justice. I know you all are in the social justice space, so this may be actually your biggest strength within the organization, but it's important that we still think about what does this actually mean for your team. Oftentimes when I work with organizations that are really focused, again, think about my organ procurement department, right? They were so focused on everything else going on in their world and how they were saving, like they literally saving lives every day, that they forgot to look inward and realize, are we creating the culture inside of our own house that we want? And so you have to make sure that the experience that an employee has every day mirrors the values that you want the rest of the world to be having from interacting with you. And so it's really important that you pull back the curtain on this. We teach this concept of iceberg model as a key piece of it. Are you thinking of diversity not just as those items that are above the waterline that are visible to us, but all of the parts of the iceberg that are below the waterline that are far more likely to trip us up? Most importantly, introducing your employees to this concept so that they start to understand things like unconscious bias and what does that mean in their day-to-day, so that it starts to understand, so they can start to see where in their interactions with their team members, with new hires, with individuals in interviews experience, how does all of this play in? One of the things that I always encourage folks to remember is one of the challenges with unconscious bias is not only are we having 11 judgments, here's the science behind this, 11 judgments in the first 7 seconds that we meet someone. So we worry about how that impacts how we interact with them, but guess what? They're doing the same thing back. So when candidates or new hires are interacting with you, what kinds of reflections and instantaneous judgments might they have? And how does it impact turnover? And more importantly, how does it impact whether or not they immediately feel like you have an inclusive environment that aligns with your mission, vision, and values? From that perspective, taking time to really talk about as an organization, we often talk in diversity space around, you'll hear organizations talk about, we need a culture of respect. I think of cultures of respect as similarly to compliance in HR. It's your minimum bar. Respectful environments are like, that just means I don't show up and I don't show up and people treat me poorly. It should be your minimum bar. Inclusion, slightly better, but inclusion still says, I've invited you in to be part of my culture, which assumes you're going to adapt, you're going to be included, but you can't necessarily be your whole self. Instead, ask yourself, do we have a culture of belonging? Do we have a culture where people can bring their whole self to work and not just feel tolerated for it, but more importantly, they feel celebrated and they want to celebrate others and their individuality? So do you have that kind of a culture? Because if you do internally, then what your organization can do from externally is just tenfold of what you will accomplish if people don't feel like they belong when they're working internally within the team. So an important piece to keep in mind and to ask yourself, if you haven't made progress in this journey, it's not just about training. We often think about diversity, equity, inclusion in terms of, oh, we have to send people to training. I will tell you, if you really want to create a culture of belonging, you first have to think about that entire employment experience, all the way down to, do your policies align with your concepts of inclusion? Do your policies create an environment of belonging, or do they exclude people, maybe not intentionally, but unintentionally? This could be things like, what holidays do you celebrate? This could be things like, if somebody celebrates a holiday that is not one of your company holidays, do they have to take paid time off? Or do they have other options like floating holidays that others can take, that everybody can take, but they get to choose when they take it? So for example, if I am Jewish, do I have to take Rosh Hashanah and some of these other holidays as a personal PTO day, or do I have ways to get compensated differently? Same things goes for compensation. Do your compensation philosophies and practices, are they just blindly passed out? And if I negotiate better, then I get more money? Or are they equitable in their approach? That comes with having a strong philosophy around what you're doing. What are your internal promotional practices? How do you post when positions are open? How do people get considered for new openings? All of these practices, beyond just what we train people and how we treat people when we have, luncheons and engagement opportunities, but what are the policies behind the scenes that may be undermining what you thought was a very inclusive or a culture of belonging along the way? So you've got a great checklist here in front of you, right? Now you can think about, what are my compliance pieces? What are my foundational structure pieces? What are the HR excellent pieces? And where am I based on the growth and what we have going on in the organization? So you've got this long list, probably after an hour and a half of hearing all the things you're supposed to be thinking of, and you're going, holy cow, Katie, what am I going to do with all of this? The idea is here, you're not going to accomplish it all at one time. Instead, you really need to think about, what are the areas that came out for your SWOT analysis, and then think about, what are the things that are just really quick hits. They can be done in 1 to 6 months. Maybe they're compliance, maybe they're just something. I've got a client who's got a smoking policy that everybody hates. And when I asked why they have that smoking policy, turns out because I asked the HR lady why that was her policy. And she's like, well, I just don't think people should smoke because it's bad for your health. And I was like, but you're losing half of your staff over it. So maybe we need to pick our battles. So if there's quick wins, we just hit those, we get those done and we move along. Figure out, what are your short-term goals? What are the things that have to be done in the first 6 to 18 months in order for you to be in good shape? These are likely compliance type things that are a little longer than a quick hit, but need to be buttoned up. Or maybe it's an HR infrastructure piece, but it's not going to take 3 years to get it to implement. It's just going to take a shorter piece. And then you're going to have some things that are very visionary and long-term goals. It's okay. Know that you're not going to get everything done in the first 6 to 18 months, 6 months to 18 months of this. But if you start to categorize them, now your vision and your strategy for HR will start to take shape, and it won't feel like, oh, that's another thing we got to fix. And that's another thing we got to fix. Instead, it's, you know what? We don't do interviewing as well as we should, but we also aren't doing a big chunk of hiring now. So for us, maybe that's a long-term goal. For other organizations, it may be a short-term goal. And then most importantly, think about, what are your resources? What are things that you absolutely should do in-house and you should keep in-house versus where do you have staff? So do you bring in a full-time generalist? Do you bring in a director of HR? Do you bring in just a recruiter? Staffing models in HR can make a huge difference. And there's a lot of things. We have lots of clients who maybe use us to help build strategy and do the larger pieces. And then they have an in-house recruiter because that's something that somebody can do in-house daily and it's important. There's other models where somebody says, you know what, we're going to handle it all in-house and we're just going to call you when we have issues. There's other people who I'm like, no, you need a whole department. We had a client that went from 3 employees to 135 employees in less than a year. We did all their HR to start. And then we were like, oh, you guys need everybody in-house. And so we staffed an infrastructure that made sense. Thinking about what this looks like based on the outcomes of your SWOT analysis makes a big deal, makes a huge difference along the way. And what resources you need. Is it a third-party administrator for COBRA? Is it a payroll provider? Is it an HRIS system? It's not always the same. The key is making sure you understand what's the plan for the 1 to 3 years and what is the best way for you to go about meeting that along the way. Hopefully, everything we went through today gives you a ton of things to think about around the checklist. And please use these slides. If you haven't already gotten copies of them, you will get them. Use these slides for that checklist as a starting point. Also know we are here to help. And this is not a sell, this is an offer. We do this for any organization that attends webinars that we give, or for those of you who are even watching the recording, we offer a free HR strategy session, which essentially means you get on the phone with myself, one of our team members, and we ask you all sorts of questions and help issue spot and help understand what challenges you're running into in all these different levels, and then put together the recommendations for you of here's the things that you need to be able to move forward and have some success or deal with that challenge that really just feels like it's like keeping you up all night. And most importantly, we can also give you some advice on based on your personal circumstance. If you're thinking like, what pieces should we keep in-house? What pieces shouldn't we? How do we go about figuring that out? And most importantly, what level person do you need internally to be able to really do the work the right way from an HR perspective? So if you want to send a text message to that send HR info to that number, we will reach out, we will get you scheduled, no charge, no commit, like literally it is, here are your recommendations and good advice on how to go about applying them. So hopefully everybody will find that really useful as you grow. Humberto, with that in mind, I know we are right at the bottom of the hour. I will leave it open if somebody has questions, and I will go back to somebody just said, can we go back to the contact page? Yes, feel free to reach out with questions after this as well.
Thank you. I feel like we both did a deep dive and just scratched the surface.
I know.
So I appreciate so much everything that you shared with us. Brenda's going to launch a quick exit poll. And while she does that, I'm just going to let folks know that please feel free to reach out to Katie. She's going to be available to you all. The recording is going to be available on the webpage, so you can always go back to revisit. We're also going to be emailing these slides to you, so don't feel like if you didn't get a chance to jot everything down, or if you just want to review it again, there will be a space for that. So thank you so much, Katie, for your time. Really appreciate all the insight that you shared with us. And we're looking forward to the next workshop, which will be on Thursday, February 24th. And we're going to make it a very kind of participatory group project type of work. It's going to be focused on scaling organizational and leadership structure in this context of fast growth. So thanks again, Katie, and thanks everyone for participating.
Thank you all. Have a great day, everyone.